But now we're going to shift from our focus on some of the research findings on spirituality and mental health and well-being to practical implications. And in particular, how do we develop competence in doing the work of integrating the spiritual dimension into psychotherapy? And again, to put this into context, let me just provide a little bit of background. There's been a real sea change in attitudes of the mental health field to the spirituality over the past 50 years. Back in the early days, in the 20th century, the field was dominated by behaviorism and psychodynamic perspectives, and the leaders of both orientations, B.F. Skinner and Sigmund Freud, viewed religion antagonistically. For instance, Freud wrote that religion works by distorting the picture of the real world in delusional manner, by forcibly fixing adherents in a state of psychical infantilism, and by drawing them into a mass delusion. Not exactly a friendly attitude toward religion, but this attitude manifested itself in the field in many ways. I recall sharing with a faculty member in the psychology department at my university an interview I had with an undergraduate who described the support she felt from God by praying to him as she went to her classes. And his response was, "Well, how long has she been schizophrenic?" And he wasn't joking. This kind of attitude is still, it's not a whole thing wholly of the past, but there has been a shift. And the shift has been from antagonism more to disregard or disinterest, call it neglect. In the 1970s, research in the psychology of religion and spirituality was pretty sparse, as I noted. But things were beginning to change. I think many mental health professionals felt that something was missing in the main therapeutic paradigms of the time. They felt these paradigms didn't deal with the deeper existential concerns, meaning, human strengths and resources, human finitude and frailty. And they didn't deal with the possibility of change and transformation. And I think there seemed to be a yearning for a deeper psychology that could encompass these aspects of what it means to be human. And I think as one reflection of that yearning, we saw that rise in studies of religion and spirituality, as I noted in my last talk. This research wasn't only interesting from theoretical and scientific points of view, it was really practically important because it created a strong evidence-based rationale for integrating spirituality into mental health care. What was this rationale? Well, let me just briefly review it. The research showed that religion is a cultural fact, that in fact, many people identify with religion. Global studies continue to show that. And many people continue to believe in God or a higher power. Again, global studies show that. In addition, many people want spiritually sensitive care, including clients in psychotherapy. And as I reviewed in the last talk, spirituality is a resource to many people. It's linked to positive mental health, but it's also linked to poor mental health, the double-sided sword, the double-sided coin. In addition, spirituality, when it's integrated in treatment, a number of exciting studies have shown that it's as effective, and in some cases more effective, than traditional secular treatments. I should add that I think the field is moving to greater appreciation for the power of identity and social context and cultural diversity in shaping who we are, and sensitivity to the diverse ways of being human is now an ethical mandate in the mental health fields. And that includes religion and spirituality. They're included now within many countries beneath the umbrella of cultural diversity and cultural competence. I noticed these changes myself in the reception to my workshops that I had been giving since the 1980s, uh, I started to receive less kinds of antagonistic responses and more interest, but confusion. Many mental health providers were willing to try to address spirituality in treatment, but they just didn't know how. They were confused. And they had good reason to be confused. Surveys showed in the US and globally that uh, most training programs in the mental health did not provide any training in religion and spirituality. And that's not just in psychology, also true in social work. So we can't blame the lack of training here either on a lack of resources, because the field has grown so much over the last 25 years. We have journals devoted to the topic. We have really great books that have been published. And we have this growing evidence base that creates this powerful rationale for integration. So now we're moving to, I think, a more integrated approach to spirituality in the context of mental health. So our field has come a long way from antagonism to neglect to confusion to an interest in integration of spirituality and mental health. But here's the key question now. How? How do we integrate spirituality into clinical training and practice in ways that are effective? So I'm going to focus on this question in this workshop. But to do that, I want to first define what I mean by spiritually integrated care. It's holistic. It has to do with people as bio, psychological, social, and spiritual beings. It assumes that each of these is a dimension of who we are. It's integrative. It has to do with how well we help people put the bits and pieces of their lives together. Clients who come to therapy often feel broken, wounded, and they're looking for help in integrating the pieces of themselves that may have come disconnected. And we as mental health providers can play an important part in this process of building integration and wholeness. It's pluralistic. Spiritually integrated care is not specific to any tradition, though it recognizes that treatments must always be informed by the individual's larger religious and spiritual context, whatever it may be. I should add here that personal religiousness doesn't equip us to do spiritually integrated care. If you assume you know someone's religiousness because you belong to the same denomination, or you assume that your own personal devotion is the same as competence in this area, then I think then your religiousness can become a liability, not an asset. On the other hand, being non-religious or from a different religious tradition than your client doesn't disqualify you from doing spiritually integrated care. The key is your openness, your sensitivity, your willingness to learn, your humility, your willingness to be informed. And I want to stress that spiritually integrated therapy is not a competitor to existing treatments. It can be integrated into any approach to mental health care. So spiritually integrated therapy, I don't call it SIP, along the same lines as CBT or DBT or ACT. It's an approach that should be integrated within any therapeutic orientation. I want to add this too, that I don't think becoming more competent in spiritually integrated care means that you have to spend years of advanced training to get those skills. I remember a physician at a workshop on spiritually integrated therapy said to me, "Oh, great. Now, not only do I have to do a physical exam, complete a computerized record, build a relationship with my patient, relate to other medical providers, now I have to attend to spiritual issues." Well, I responded to him that, well, look, you don't have to be an expert. you can create powerful opportunities for change by just doing some very basic things. So we'll take a look at some of those in a second. So what do we mean by spiritual competencies? Well, spiritual competencies refer to the basic attitudes, knowledge, and skills in the area of spirituality that contribute to effective mental health care. My colleague, Cassie Veaton, and others have worked for quite a while now to identify specific competencies. She's come up with 18 of them. In later work, we've shortened that list to 5 basic spiritual competencies, and I'll just present them to you briefly now. Practitioners should be aware of how their own spiritual and or religious backgrounds, oops, let me get this back here. Okay. Of how their own religious and spiritual backgrounds may influence their attitudes, perceptions, and beliefs and assumptions about the nature of psychological processes in their practice. I've lost my screen here. I want to get back to my screen. Okay, here, just a second here. Oops, okay. Practitioners appreciate the ways that spirituality and religion may support psychological well-being and support clients in accessing their spiritual and religious strengths and resources. 3, practitioners should be able to identify and address problems related to spirituality and religion that may adversely affect people's psychological functioning. That's that double-sided coin again. 4, practitioners inquire about people's spiritual and religious backgrounds, beliefs, and practices as a routine part of mental health practice. This is about spiritual assessment. And finally, practitioners practice within the boundaries of their competence in addressing religion and spirituality, and they consult, refer to, and collaborate with clergy and other qualified individuals when appropriate. This is about working within our own boundaries of competence, and that is an ethical kind of standard fields. So let me talk about 3 spiritual competencies and some practical suggestions for building them. First, let's talk about, oops. Okay, now I'm losing my ability to move my slides forward here. Okay, I'm going to have to stop the sharing and start it again to get this thing working okay. So just excuse me for a second while I do this. Okay, now we're going to share again. Great. Okay, now we're cooking. Okay, spiritual competency number 1, spiritual assessment. Clients generally are happy to talk about the place of spirituality in their lives, but they hold back because they have a feeling that we as providers may be uncomfortable or unwilling to listen. And in fact, some of us are. But in doing that, we may overlook some potentially vital transformational resources. And we can ask some basic questions that encourage a spiritual conversation, and these can be a part of the initial general assessment. Just a few simple questions. Do you see yourself as a religious or spiritual person? And if so, in what way? Are you affiliated with a religious or spiritual denomination or community? If so, which one? Has your problem affected you religiously or spiritually? If so, in what way? This gets at the possibility that a person's psychological problems that bring them into treatment may impact them spiritually, perhaps in the form of a spiritual struggle. Has your religion been involved in the way you've dealt with your problem? If so, in what way? And the answer to this question may point the way to how spirituality is a potential resource in problem solving. So these are all very basic kinds of questions that can be integrated in the flow of the general initial assessment. But asking spiritual questions isn't enough, because we want to facilitate a conversation. And how do we do that? Well, we need the client's permission to enter the spiritual world. And we do that by conveying a deep interest in seeing life as it looks through the client's eyes. And maybe most importantly, a willingness to be taught by the client, especially in the spiritual realm. There's no crime in admitting a lack of knowledge, and far from it, a little dose of therapeutic humility can really empower clients who, by the time they come to therapy, may often feel that they have little to teach anyone. But by conveying this willingness to be taught, the therapist sets the stage for a partnership in the process of learning. So the proper response, the critical therapeutic statement when a client raises something in the spiritual area, it's not to cut off conversation by saying, "Oh, I know just what you mean because I'm from your denomination or I'm also religious." Instead, you should say, "Well, I'd like to learn more about what you're saying. Could you tell me more?" It opens up the dialogue and the conversation rather than shuts it down. Now, sometimes this initial spiritual assessment doesn't prove to be informative. Clients may not share much about their religious or spiritual background because it's sensitive. They may want to wait to develop more trust in you before responding to these questions. And that's one reason why I don't generally uh, use a battery of religious and spiritual measures, psychometric measures, in my own clinical work with clients when they come in. Sometimes that can be useful, but I feel that spiritual assessment is a process that develops and evolves across the therapy. And the initial assessment is only an initial assessment. And what we learn about spirituality may change and shift over the course of treatment. And I've presented some examples of that in my writings. So when someone says, "Oh, no, I'm not particularly religious, and no, I'm not part of a religious community," that doesn't mean that you want to then suspend interest in this domain. We can ask other questions, and I like to talk about an implicit spiritual assessment, where we open the door to the possibility of some psychospiritual processes going on. And psychospiritual questions here, really, they kind of fall in between the realm of spirituality and psychology. They're kind of in between questions that hint at a deeper dimension to the person's life. I really love asking these questions. These are certainly not traditional clinical questions that we are taught to ask in our formal training, but I found them very useful. Here, for example, can you tell me where you draw your strength and courage to go on? Can you tell me where you find peace in your life? What sustains you in the midst of all of your troubles? Why do you think it's important for you to be here in this world? Talk about when you felt most deeply and fully alive. These kinds of questions, I think, again, open the door to a deeper conversation, and sometimes a more explicit conversation about religious and spiritual matters. Okay, let's talk a little bit about a second competency, and that's accessing spiritual resources. We know that our clients don't come to therapy empty-handed. They bring with them a pool of resources that have helped them deal with the trials and challenges they faced throughout their lives. But we also know that in times of stress, clients often lose touch with their resources that have helped sustain them through thick and thin. I remember when my wife was having our child, I was racing to get to the hospital because I think she was going into labor very quickly. I thought she'd have the baby very quickly, which she did. And in the hospital, they wheeled my wife up to the delivery room right away, but they wouldn't let me go up until I registered at the front desk. And they were asking me questions like my name, which I got right, and then my address, which for the life of me I couldn't remember, phone number, a total blank. And this was the issue for me too. I lost touch with my resources in the midst of a crisis. But depression, anxiety, interpersonal conflicts, life stressors, they can all result in disorientation in which we forget about what's worked for us in the past. In essence, we lose our rhythm. And I think this is a really important way of thinking about how people are affected by psychological problems and crisis and transition. We lose our rhythm that sustains us, our physical rhythm, our psychological rhythm, our behavioral rhythm, and our social rhythm. And I think one of the most important things we do as therapists is to help clients regain their rhythm, get back in touch with, so they can access their resources. And doing so, I think, is so important because it reminds them that they're not starting from scratch, that they already have strengths, they already have resources that they can build on. In times of difficulty, clients can also lose touch with their spiritual resources. And as we're going to talk about now, we can help clients relocate and access their spiritual resources. So let me give you one clinical example. And this involves the story of Bob, who I called a good Samaritan, I think with good reason. Bob was a big, beefy guy, a truck driver, and he witnessed a terrible crash while driving. And he pulled over on the road and he helped a disabled trucker on the highway. And what Bob experienced then was a real nightmare. And he pulled the driver out of the truck on the highway, and another car came around at high speed and hit the truck, and the driver was instantly killed. Bob tried to stay and help with the situation there, but it all led to the development of PTSD symptoms. He had nightmares, he had physiological symptoms, he was nauseated, and he couldn't go back to work. I worked with him for several months to desensitize him to the images and manage his emotional upset. But I really didn't make a lot of progress. And so I took a step back and I asked him about his life more generally. I also brought his wife in to ask her about his life before the accident. And it turned out that Bob was an active member of his church. He'd been a leader of his church for many years, and he'd helped many other people. But no one in the church knew what Bob had gone through. He had withdrawn from the church after the accident. When I talked with him about the possibility of reconnecting with the church and letting people know in the church about what he was going through, he resisted initially. He said, it's just so horrible what I've been through, and I don't want to become a burden to anyone just to hear that and to talk to me about it. So we spent a lot of time trying to help him overcome that type of concern and barrier. And in fact, I talked with him about how actually I reframed sharing his story with people as an opportunity to give them a chance to give back to him. Here he was a good Samaritan to so many people. Now he had the chance to let them give back to him, which was a good thing. And eventually he agreed, maybe a little reluctantly, but I suggested, Bob, just go talk about what you've been experiencing to one person in your church. So his pastor was a very good friend. So he told his pastor what he'd been through. And when he came back the next week into therapy, he had a smile on his face. And I said, you got a smile on your face. How have things been going? He said, well, I'll tell you, I've been love bombed. He said, I told the pastor what I went through, and since I did that, everybody's been coming over my house, dropping off food. I'm sure I gained another 10 pounds this week. They're talking to me. They won't leave me alone. But I could tell that he was really felt affirmed and supported by the members of his church. And I do think that was an important part, maybe even a turning point for Bob in dealing with his PTSD. And it's a simple point. I helped him access the support that was available to him, but that he had lost touch with through his crisis. Spiritual resources come in a variety of shapes and sizes. I've already mentioned spiritual coping resources. Here are some others. There are cognitive resources, for instance, the Nicene Creed of beliefs, fundamental Christian beliefs, and God's role in times of suffering. There are behavioral resources, such as walking a labyrinth or funeral rituals or prayer, confession. There are experiential resources designed to foster a sense of connection with something transcendent, such as meditation or walking in the woods or chanting. There are relational resources, such as communal worship or volunteerism, counseling from clergy, and so on. And there are motivational resources designed to help people find a source of ultimate meaning in their lives. For instance, intentional, inspirational readings, such as Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Life or Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Let me just briefly run through 10 tips that I offer for how to integrate spiritual resources into therapy. First, take a deep breath. If you're not used to the idea of broaching spirituality in treatment, it may seem daunting, but really, again, it's not rocket science. You don't need to be an expert in theology or an experienced religious practitioner to be an effective therapist. And remember, you already have a lot of the clinical skills and experience in working with sensitive topics, and you can use all of them here. So you're really not starting from scratch. You can do this. It's important to be self-aware, aware of your own experience with religious and spiritual resources, what you feel comfortable with in working with your clients and what may not be comfortable for you. It's important to give yourself permission to talk about spirituality in therapy. Remember, you've got the research on your side that these resources can truly be helpful. And remember that surveys show most clients would like to be able to talk about spirituality. Remember that spirituality should be integrated into rather than set apart from therapy. For instance, the initial assessment questions can be easily integrated into other questions. If you're asking about coping resources for dealing with depression or anxiety or family problems, you can ask about secular coping resources, then you can ask about spiritual coping resources, and it can flow very nicely. But you should remember, we're talking about sacred matters. They need to be handled with sensitivity and care, and clients may not be comfortable in talking about them, and that needs to be honored too. They may be willing to do it after they've established a sense of trust and safety in the relationship. And these resources will need to be tailored to specific clients, their needs and preferences. Some clients I've found, for instance, are not interested in mindfulness meditation. They find it inconsistent with their own religious beliefs and practices. We need to remind clients that it takes time to reap the benefits of spiritual resources. They're called spiritual disciplines because it takes discipline to become good at meditating or to become good at doing spiritual practices of different kinds. So, clients need to be cautioned about being patient. We have to be ready to address barriers to integrating spiritual resources, as I had to figure out a way to encourage Bob to access members of his church, and come to terms with that fear he had that he was going to upset people if he shared his own psychological distress and experience. It's important to work with your own personal and professional boundaries. And it's really important to remember, we're not theologians, we're not pastors, we're not experts in comparative religion. And spiritual issues that go beyond our competence should be raised with consultants, clergy, or referred to other resources. And it's good to have additional spiritual resources on hand for clients. So books and tapes can be really valuable for clients who wanted to learn more. Okay, the third competency is addressing spiritual problems. And here I want to talk about how we deal with spiritual struggles. And one of the questions that came up in the last hour, I think Daryl raised it, was how do you help people who are struggling come to terms with that fork in the road, and in that possible vital choice they have to make about how to come to terms with their struggle. So let me just give you some thoughts here. First of all, here's an example. A number of years ago, I worked with a 58-year-old African-American male. I'll call him George. And he looked like a man who was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was bent and haggard, deep-set red-rimmed eyes that seemed to fade, to stare off far into the distance. Before I could even take him back to my office, he said in the waiting room, "My brother Joe is dead. My brother Joe is dead." And I said to him, "Well, why don't you come with me to my office so we can talk about your brother?" So he followed me to my office and took a seat and kept repeating, "My brother Joe is dead," for several minutes. That's all he could say. It was almost as if the reality of his brother's death was stuck in his throat and he couldn't swallow it. So I simply sat with him for a few minutes, and then I asked him if he could tell me about his brother and what had happened. And I learned that recently his brother Joe had died from cancer, and George had been the primary caretaker for his brother. Not only that, in the last 3 years, he had lost both of his parents to cancer and heart disease, and he had lost both of his adult sons to cancer and a neurodegenerative disorder. Again, George was the primary caretaker for all of them. He watched them go through terrible suffering as they died. In spite of his trials, for much of his life, George had been sustained by his faith. He was a deacon of his AME church. It's an African Methodist evangelical church in the United States. I asked George whether he might have found support through his church. And he told me that he spoke to his pastor, but his pastor said, "Well, surely you must have stepped out of God's good graces at some point in your life." And George just shook his head and said he calls himself a man of God. I asked George what was the most painful part of all of these terrible experiences. And he answered with one word: why? Why, he asked, was God putting him through this hell? Why had God singled him out for this misery? He saw other young men in his community, same age as his sons, and they were involved in gangs and crime and drugs, but they were healthy, they were alive. Why hadn't God taken them? His brother Joe was the best man George had ever known, a man who touched everyone he knew with love. Why had God taken Joe? Who was this God, and how could he ever pray to this kind of God again? And then if this was who God was, George said, this was no God he could ever love. If this was who God was, George said, he hated him. Now, George had been traumatized in every way imaginable, psychologically, socially, physically. But what's important is that he perceived what he perceived as the the greatest trauma of all was spiritual. He was suffering from PTSD for sure, but that clinical diagnosis really didn't do full justice to his experience. On top of everything else, he was experiencing a religious struggle. And oftentimes in our work with people facing various crises and traumas, we overlook the spiritual impact of their trauma. But there are times when it's these conflicts in the spiritual realm that are the most important issues that they face. And that was certainly the case with George. So, how do we help people who are struggling spiritually in therapy come to terms in some way with their struggle? Well, let me start first by talking about what not to do. Don't change the subject. People often do want to talk about their struggles, and they may be an important part of their problems. But don't assume you understand, because struggles are diverse and experienced in very individual ways. Don't judge. Your willingness to take a non-judgmental approach is often met with relief and sets the stage for further conversation. And really don't offer easy answers or bromides. It takes time to help people with struggles. And the longitudinal studies have shown so far that struggles do take a long time to resolve. And it may take months and even years for struggles to yield positive transformations. And as I'm suggesting, don't slip into the role of theologians and clergy. What do we do? Well, first and foremost, just listen. Really, just listen. People respond with such grief, with such relief and gratitude when they find a listening ear for their struggles, when struggles are accepted rather than rebuked. The normalization of struggles, to say that they're a common part of life that many people experience, can be really reassuring. And of everything I did with George, I think simply listening was the most helpful thing. Because, it's very difficult for loved ones to listen to people they care about when they're going through terrible situations. We do want to try to solve the problem. We want to comfort them immediately. We want to make them feel better immediately. We can't sit with them through their pain because it's so painful for us. And so for people to find someone who can truly be there with them and sit there and be present and listen, I believe is one of the greatest gifts that we can provide. We need to encourage acceptance rather than avoidance of struggles. Acceptance is really a prerequisite to coming to terms with the struggle. I really like this quote from R.D. Laing, the psychiatrist. He said, "There's a great deal of pain in life, and perhaps the only pain in life that can be avoided is the pain that comes from trying to avoid pain." It's really a great quote. And then we can try to foster hope and wholeness. When we put struggles into a meaningful, life-affirming, hopeful context, I found it really useful to talk to people about kintsugi. Kintsugi is a Japanese, it's based on a Japanese philosophy of what's called wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection. And it involves breaking a whole ceramic piece, shattering it, and then putting the pieces back together again with gold or silver filigree. And in the process, a whole new wholeness is created out of brokenness. And I think the product, as you see some examples here, is a work of art. In fact, I think the broken piece that's put together is more beautiful than the piece that was that hadn't been shattered. This is very helpful to clients who feel broken and hopeless, and to be able to talk to them about they too can put the pieces back together again of their lives. Their struggles can be, again, a launching pad for change. And the process of putting the pieces back together again, they become works of art. We can try to broaden and deepen spiritual resources in a number of ways. Let me give you the example of some work that my former wonderful graduate student was involved in, Nicole Murray Swank. She was working with sexually abused women, and she found that many were struggling with God, who was seen as a male figure, um, and they could not relate to this male God as a resource because the maleness of God just brought to mind their abuse. So she created a guided imagery exercise to help these women broaden their image of God beyond male attributes. And this imagery was called God as a waterfall. Imagine God as a waterfall. She writes, and she does this orally with her clients. Picture God as a waterfall within you, pouring down cool, refreshing water, the waters of love, healing restoration throughout your body. A cool, refreshing waterfall washing down over your head, your face, your shoulders, your neck, out through your arms, down your legs, out through your toes. Refreshing, bringing life-quenching thirst, renewing, refreshing, and restoring. These are just some of the ways we can facilitate the competencies of a spiritual assessment, accessing spiritual resources, and addressing spiritual struggles. And I hope this gives you some ideas of how you can integrate spirituality effectively into treatment. But I want to move ahead a little quickly here to ask an important question. Can we train providers to be more spiritually competent? We think so. My colleagues and I, over the last 7 years, have designed what we call the SCTMH course. It's a training program for mental health providers in diverse fields to meet 16 basic spiritual competencies. Again, it's based on this growing body of theory and research on spirituality and mental health. And we use adult learning methods, online training, 8 hours of multimedia content that deals with different competencies, such as how to distinguish helpful and harmful types of treatment, assessment, mobilizing spiritual resources, addressing spiritual problems, and ethical issues and challenges. We evaluated changes in skills and knowledge and attitudes and found that our participants, a couple of hundred mental health providers, made significant improvements in their attitude, knowledge, and skills. The large majority felt that this training was very effective for them. And interestingly, 97% said that the online format for them was easy to use. I had questions about that. One participant said, "This was very informative. It helped me see that spirituality and religion could be integrated without it being seen as conversion or trying to put your viewpoint on others, but rather using where they're already coming from as a source of healing and understanding." The bottom line was that we were successful in demonstrating that training in this kind of care is possible. So we've replicated this evaluation now in 3 studies with, again, good results, and including an extension of this competency training to graduate training programs. So now we're thinking globally. We're planning for a global initiative to foster spiritual competency training. So this really is an exciting time as we move forward towards a more integrated approach to psychological care and training, and one that really acknowledges that we're spiritual as well as psychological, social, and physical beings. If you're interested in accessing this SCTMH program for a nominal course, here's a link. It's edx.org/course/spiritual-competency-training-in-mental-health. So at this point, I think I'll stop again and open it up. Thank you for listening to me for these talks, and open it up to questions.
Okay. Thank you, Professor, for sharing with us many practical skills to integrate spirituality into psychotherapies. Let's see whether we have any comments and questions among our participants. Any comments and questions? There's one comment and question.
Okay, Professor, I'm Casey from the Toma College. I want to ask a question about, is there any requirement for the spiritual background of the psychotherapist or the counselor in attending your program, your online program, to use the spiritual resources?
Yes, very good question. No, there's no spiritual qualification that you need for the program. And I should say, one of the questions that we had was whether people who were less spiritual or religious could make as effective use of the program as providers who are more spiritual and religious. And we found that the program was equally effective for those who are more and less spiritual and religious. So it seems like both groups found the program equally valuable and gained equally.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from participants?
I can add too to that, my response there, that as I've suggested, your own personal spiritual or religious background can be a wonderful resource in working with clients, but it can also be a barrier in working with clients if we assume a level of similarity. So, and then as a result of that, we don't explore the rich variety of ways people can experience their faith. I've often said there is no such thing as the Christian client, the Buddhist client, the Jewish client, the Hindu client, because there's so much diversity within each tradition, and we have to be open to that and not assume that that the members of a particular denomination are all alike.
Hello, Professor Pargamen. Thank you very much for the inspiring sharing. This is Terence from HKBU, Baptist University. Well, as an educator and pastor ourselves, we find the practical tips what you just offer very, very, very useful. I just got two questions here. The first one is in regard to the suggestions in different ways how to help people from diverse backgrounds. Would you offer one or two more extra tips if we encounter undergraduates or clients or patients who actually caught up with relapse situation? So some of the students we deal with, they sort of having a lot of, well, psychological therapy experience or different encounter before. So they sort of having heard what you mentioned, and when we try to, well, deal with them, any extra caution should we pay attention to? That's the first question. The second question is rather, well, out of curiosity. I just want to know a little bit more about George. So what happened with George in the end after, you know, such a traumatic experience? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me talk about George first. I worked with him for a year, and over that time, he gradually regained, I think, some emotional stability. He was able to, he started to go back to his church to teach Sunday school, which he had done for a number of years. So he was able to kind of reconnect that way. He was still struggling with God when we terminated the treatment, and he said he felt like he has gone as far as he wanted to in therapy. But I was really curious about where he was going to take this. So I called him, oh, I don't know, maybe 6 months later, and asked him if he'd be willing to talk with me about, you know, how he's doing. And he said, sure. And we were talking about it, and he seemed to be continuing to do better. And then I asked him, George, where do you stand with God now? I know you've really been wrestling with him as a result of all of your experiences. Where do you stand with God? And he said, well, me and God, we've declared a truce. He's in his corner and I'm in my corner, and we're not wrestling with each other anymore. We're just okay in our own corners. So that's where he had gone to after probably a year and a half, which is an example of how these kinds of struggles are not easily resolved or quickly resolved. He had made some movement towards, I think, some resolution, but it wasn't certainly the close, loving relationship he had had with God for much of his life. But that's not to say he wouldn't eventually move further in that direction. I suspect he might, but I thought that was an interesting example of how you can't expect people to resolve spiritual struggles in a linear way, as someone suggested, or over a short period of time. So, and I'm sorry, you'll have to repeat your first question for me.
For sure, it's my bad. Actually, I should change the order of asking the question. Is rather practical again, because sometimes we caught up with situations that the patients or the students, they have a lots of experiences with psychotherapy. May it be Christian or non-Christian paradigm. So in some occasions, they got a lot of defense mechanism. Well, we already try to be as less religious as possible. But you know, the struggle, just like, Tung and Kurt mentioned yesterday, while they may be Christian nuns now, but they still got some spiritual appetite. So it's like they have a bit of tension. In some way, they don't want to high dosage of Christianity. But at the same time, they do want us to offer some advice from the God's perspective. So we stuck in between as well. So how to juggle between the two poles or the dimensions? I know this is not a very good question, but just some practical insights we would like to seek from you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I love that question because it speaks to where many people find themselves now, particularly students who, again, in their emerging adulthood, may be really trying to grapple with questions of identity, questions of differentiating from their systems of origin, their families, their religious communities that they grew up in, and finding a set of beliefs that are authentic for themselves. And they're looking for some help with that. And it sounds like you're seeing that many of those students continue to yearn for a kind of sacred connection. And Daryl has talked a lot and studied this notion of yearning for the sacred. And that's what they're experiencing, but they're struggling with that. And I think the things that we've been talking about here are very relevant to therapeutic work with those students. Most importantly, giving students space in therapy to talk about and explore where they stand with these questions without providing definitive answers for them, but allowing them to do the exploration that's needed for growth. That can be difficult, especially if you're coming from a particular religious tradition where you want to offer the answers from a particular religious worldview. And yet, if you're working primarily as therapists, I believe the primary obligation is to create a safe space for exploration without necessarily imposing our own preferences on them.
Okay, thank you for the reply. Because of the time limits, we may only allow one more questions. Maybe as a moderator, I ask the last questions. There is an increasing number of people without any religious belief. May I ask how to promote spirituality for those without a religious belief? How can we help them?
Well, I think the question for them is whether they're coming to us with that yearning. Are they seeking a greater and a deeper spirituality? What are they looking for themselves? And if they are, then then it's important to explore what may be affecting their search for the things that are sacred to them in their lives. And that can be many things. There can be many barriers to that. And giving people the chance to explore how they understand the sacred. What are the pathways that are most meaningful to them? For instance, I often ask my clients, where do you find the sacred in your life? What are the things that you can do in your life to foster a sense of spiritual connectedness? Those are very basic kinds of questions, but among those who want to pursue a deeper spirituality, I think they're really useful questions that people can begin maybe to think outside the usual box that they're in and come up with some creative ways to experience sacredness and God in new ways that they hadn't done before.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kenneth PARGAMENT. Thank you for your presentation, and we have to stop here. Maybe we can contact later through your email or any comments and questions are welcome to send to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed speaking with all of you.
Okay, thank you. See you again. Bye-bye.
Bye.